early on, as far back as high school, you produced a what would you call it? A parody, satirical, gossip sheet, Klepto. Do you think that without Mad and Mad Comics and Mad Magazine, that would you have ever become a underground cartoonist? Was this all linear and all part of the?
You know, it's a good question. I think they're not just me. I mean, a good part of my generation was profoundly influenced by Harvey Kurtzman's Mad and Humbug. Whether these things would have existed without it, who can say? But it certainly helped to have been of the age to have seen that on newsstands. It's pretty revolutionary in its day, and now you know the Mad you see on newsstands now. That's an entirely different beast. That's kind of aimed at a puerile, juvenile audience. Not to offend anyone who loves the new Mad, but it's not what Harvey Kurtzman is doing. When he started, someone at the time called it a machine gun attack on American culture, which sounds a little harsh, but nothing was sacred to him. And this was at a time, I was growing up in the 50s when, you know, it was the Eisenhower administration, the gray flannel suit. It was a very straight, very law-abiding time. Nobody was really upsetting the cart at all. And he started making fun of advertising and even other comics, you know, just parodying and making fun of things like Mickey Mouse is Mickey Rodent or Superman is Super Duperman. These were revolutionary concepts that I think encouraged my generation to, you know, be more rebellious, and we were. We raised a lot of hell, and I think a lot of it can be either blamed on Harvey Kurtzman and Mad, or we can tip our hat to him. But no question, it was deeply influential.
Mm. And was this was one of your publications?
That's when I was in college, and yeah, I co-founded a humor magazine. Colleges used to do that more. They had like a campus magazine where young writers and cartoonists could kind of break in. They're not very common anymore. The Harvard Lampoon was probably the most famous. I mean, again, it's a way to kind of test your shtick. It's like, you know, work in a small club before you can do a bigger club if you're a stage comedian. If you're a cartoonist or writer, you know, you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah, Kitchen Sink Comics was a what do you call that? Central America? No, what do you call that? The Midwest, right? The Midwestern.
Central America is another place.
Yeah. But like center of the United States. Yeah, right. You know, you had San Francisco, you had New York with the East Village, there was San Francisco with most of the cartoons there. But Wisconsin?
I can't help it, I was born there. Who can help that? I'm not there anymore, but I mean, there are worse places to be. I think in a way it kind of shaped my, what Art Spiegelman once said, my gentle Midwest humor as opposed to his, you know, raucous, hard-edged New York humor. You can't avoid, I guess, you know, literally the neighborhood you grew up in. And it probably was a gentler neighborhood than his. But what I liked about Wisconsin when I started to get into business was the rent was cheap. My competitors were places like San Francisco, New York, and I always felt they had an automatic advantage. For what they were paying in rent, I could have an extra employee. So I looked at it that way. It's a practical Midwesterner.
You also have a pragmatism that perhaps other people who involved in the underground comics, you straddled the real world, shall we say, with you did this Denis Kitchen star reporter visits Milwaukee's underground. So you
yeah, that was,
looking like a narc, but you weren't.
Yeah, actually, that's a funny example because early on, before I could really draw a salary from my young publishing company, I was a freelancer, and the example John's got up there, I haven't seen these ahead of time. I don't know what images he picked. The local paper was the Milwaukee Journal, which is a pretty big paper, and on Sunday their circulation was over 500,000. And they had a Sunday magazine, and the editor was somebody who had been a professor of mine, and he liked my work, and he loved comics, so he gave me a lot of freedom to do things like this, and he was a super straight guy who had no idea what hippies were. And my hair was long, and I had a mustache, and so he saw me dangerously veering into this territory he didn't understand, and at one point, he said, "Why don't you do a piece about that?" He said, "Explain to me what the heck this phenomenon's about." So I said, "All right, why me?" And he said, "You've got a mustache." So I used that line in there. So I infiltrated the east side of Milwaukee, which of course where I lived, and I was a hippie, and so it was kind of a semi-serious expose of what that mysterious subculture was like. And it would pay well enough that, you know, that took care of me for a month while I could do the real stuff that wasn't paying.
And you shared with me some, you also were pitched an idea, I believe, to do a regular strip, the kitchen sink, for instance, for George. Well, you hoped to work within the mainstream.
There was a brief flirtation with the idea of doing a syndicated strip. The same editor, George, was a pretty well-connected guy. He was friends with Walt Kelly, and he was, can't remember who else, but he knew all the syndicate salesmen really well, and he said, "Look, if you develop a strip, I can make sure it's seen by the top people in the business, and stick with me and I'll make you a star." And I wasn't convinced I could do that, and I wasn't necessarily interested in getting into a daily grind, even though it could be very lucrative and you can get famous much faster going that route. But I never quite thought I could be fast enough, and the idea of a gag a day or whatever was kind of intimidating. So I said, "Why don't we compromise, and I'll start by doing a weekly thing for your Sunday magazine, and if that gels and I feel comfortable, then yeah, maybe we can talk about it daily." And so I came up with some ideas that I thought were funny, cracked me up, but he didn't want to compromise. He, I think, was so intent on having me do a daily strip that he was afraid if I did a weekly for him, just keep doing it weekly, would never turn into the daily. So he thought he would jolt me into reality by saying, "No, do it my way or no way." So it just never happened.
Mm-hmm. And you also were, in the region that you were, in Wisconsin, for instance, you also were involved in regional publications as well.
The Bugle you're showing, that's an alternative / underground paper I co-founded in 1970. And it lasted 7 years, which was pretty good run for an underground paper. That one, I believe, is celebrating the 5th anniversary. Mm-hmm. And it was a rare color cover. Usually we couldn't afford full color. Typically it was just one plus another color. In fact, if any of you come to my table, I have some back issues. And the printer we had in those days had a color sample. You could literally have black plus one of 7 colors. And 5 of them were awful. They were like brown and dark purple. And the only 2 that were remotely usable were lime green and orange. So 90% of the covers I did are black and lime green or black and orange. And people, after there were so many of them, people would say, "How come you love those colors so much?" No, they were just the least worst colors that the printer offered us. So this was a rare example of all 4 colors got to be used. If you know anything about printing, that full color is 4 colors.
But we are at a comic book convention, so we need to talk comics. And this was your first comic book. This was all Denis Kitchen. Your name's even on the cover in the blurb.
Yeah, in fact, the title "Moms Don't Make Comics" is really just to set up the tagline, which is straight from the kitchen to you. So again, it's just making fun of the goofy name. And also it occurred to me, what's he saying there? Gee, Mom, you make the most delicious octopus pie in the world. Years later, I looked at that and I said, why didn't I say the most delicious octopi?
Yeah.
And you didn't have a copy of it there. Look at weirdo there.
Yeah.
Jesus is a weirdo.
But actually, speaking of Mad, the sidebars, those little circles on the side, that's kind of an homage to the early Mad magazines where Harvey Kurtzman had the elaborate borders, maybe some of you remember. And there were little circles with...
So did you, this was what, 1969?
Yes.
And you mailed them out west to San Francisco? You made sure that some of the cartoonists that you admired got copies, or how did a certain
I always was kind of what's the word, aggressive about self-promoting and getting things out there. So I wasn't shy, but I sent copies to Harvey Kurtzman and Stan Lee and people like that. And to my astonishment, I got to know them that way. It was possible in those days to write someone and get a reply, and ended up being kind of a pen pal with Stan Lee. A couple dozen letters from him in those early years, which ended up with a gig, which, knowing Jon, it's probably, or you already held up the book. But even with Harvey Kurtzman and others, if you could get an address, and that wasn't easy, I think Jay Lynch had Harvey Kurtzman's address, and Jay was always generous with sharing information. Check out his booth too if you like old undergrounds. So those led to relationships that I couldn't have expected, but I think in the back of my mind I hoped it would. I don't know if you can do that today, celebrities who are on Facebook and things and Twitter, you can theoretically reach them, but it's not the same as writing a letter and getting a letter back.
So it's one thing to produce Mom's homemade comics. It's another thing to become a publisher that was publishing the premier underground artists in the world. How did that come about?
Well, I never wanted to be a publisher. I think if you had asked me when Mom's #1 came out, which I self-published, if you had asked me what a publisher was, I'd probably have a hard time coming up with an adequate description. I instinctively didn't like publishers because all I'd ever heard about them, especially in the comics industry, was they always seemed to be sons of bitches. We all knew what happened to Siegel and Schuster with Superman, and we know the Victor Foxes and the scoundrels, especially in the earliest days, and even somebody like Bill Gaines, who was regarded as kind of a model publisher. He got in a big dispute with Harvey Kurtzman, and I think Harvey left in circumstances that were much more favorable to the publisher than to the creator. And so the last thing I wanted to be was one of those guys. But when I self-published Mom's #1 out of necessity, all I did was really just print 4,000 copies. That's all I could afford. And I distributed them locally. I sold nearly all of those on the east side of Milwaukee, which when you think about it, is not bad. If you extrapolate, would have sold 1 million. But what happened was I made good money on those 4,000 sales, and after I ran out of money, my roommate was headed out west, and he threw the last carton in the car and took them to a place called the San Francisco Comic Shop, and also to the Print Mint. And the Print Mint immediately called me. They were the underground comic publisher at the time, and they said, "Hey, we got your comic. We'd like to publish it." And I was like, "Great!" So they reprinted it with a slightly different cover and price. And the problem was, after some hounding, I finally got payment from them, but it was just a check in an envelope without anything else. And I wasn't an accountant, but I was curious how they came up with the amount. I vaguely thought they were paying me a 10% royalty, but I wanted to have them say, "Hey, we sold 10,000 copies and you got 10%. that would have made me happy, and I would have kept sending them comics forever. But there was nothing, so I innocently called the publisher there, and I said, hey, I'd like some kind of explanation for this check you sent. And he said, are you calling me a crook? And it wasn't until he said that I started thinking, well, I just want an accounting. It could have been a dishonest accounting. I probably still would have thought.
Right.
I just want some numbers on a piece of paper. And his reluctance to do that made me instantly not trust him and decide, well, I published my first one, I'll do the next one myself too, because I knew how many I could sell in my own neighborhood. At that point, I was getting to know Jay Lynch and Skip Williamson, who were the underground cartoonists in Chicago who were doing Bijou Funnies, also with Printment. And I happened to mention this to Jay. I said, I'm not going to deal with Printment anymore, I'm going to do the next one myself again. And he said, well, we're not happy with him either. You want to do ours too. And honestly, it was one of those unexpected questions and an instantaneous, not thought out answer, which was, sure, two's as easy as one. That's literally what I said to him without thinking. And in that moment, I became a publisher, because I had to be responsible for their book. And I took it seriously, and I started scrambling and figuring out a better way to get books distributed, and made damn sure they got proper accounting. And it was one of those things that by default suddenly I found myself with a business and having to develop a business model without any preparation. I had not taken a single business course in college. I had not any real experience to do this, and it's kind of the ignorance is bliss worked out, because what was on my side was, in those days, those of you of a certain age know, or you've seen, there was this rather massive counterculture happening in America, built around mostly the anti-war movement, but also, you know, the women's movement, gay movements, civil rights, all these things were percolating in the 60s, and so the business model that worked was head shops were the unifier, because one thing virtually all these people in the counterculture had in common, besides maybe the politics, was they had to find a place to buy rolling papers and beads and day-glow posters, and sure enough, there was a rack of underground comics. And that was a nice symbiotic relationship. It wasn't, in other words, that hard. I wasn't a brilliant businessman, but I was able to get them into this system reliably, and they sold and sold and sold. You'd be amazed how many some of these sold that publishers today of comic books would be very jealous. And the next big thing that happened was Robert Crumb was passing through town and visited, and we hit it off, and he gave me a book called Homegrown Funnies, and that ended up selling, I think, 140,000 copies. So, yeah, I became a publisher.
And I had corporate comics up there for a minute. You're also a publisher of socially responsible and relevant material as well, which just wasn't about head shops and smoking weed and
True.
And chicks and all that. Did you feel a social responsibility as a publisher?
Yeah, I was always. I did feel a certain responsibility on a number of levels. Again, once I realized I'm a conduit, for better or worse, for a lot of very creative people into the hands of what was then a large audience. It was my generation. At the beginning, it was all hippies, but it evolved. It went from a point of, anybody who had long hair or beard or was wearing a granny dress, they assumed they were customers. There was a really kind of a comradeship, and comics were part of the way we communicated with each other. There were underground newspapers in most major cities, and that was where you got your information. But comics were where you got your entertainment. again, back then, you didn't have all the electronic gizmos you have now. You know, comics were one of the few things you could lay back and read and laugh, and there were generational jokes, topical jokes you couldn't find anywhere else.
I would argue that Homegrown Funnies was a revolutionary comic book, and perhaps one of the greatest white man meets Bigfoot as being one of the greatest underground stories that's ever.
It is a good story. You know, Crumb is, if anybody's read Crumb, you know that he's obsessed with large women. He likes dominant women who can literally give him a piggyback ride. If you can do that, if you meet him at a convention, you'll get a very valuable original drawing if you ride him around on your shoulders. But, so this is kind of his ultimate fantasy. His character falls in love with a Yeti, you know, and escapes civilization and gets back into the woods. So you could read a lot of things into it. A lot of hippies in those days were getting back to the land and living in the woods and communes and so forth. So it had a wide appeal.
And you worked within a community of underground artists. You guys really were jamming together.
Yeah. So Pro Junior, there's an example of a business model that would not work for Marvel or DC. Pro Junior was communally owned. The artist who originally created it said anybody could use it. And so we did this comic where 23 different artists each did their interpretation and owned the copyright to it. He wasn't a particularly distinctive character. His eyeballs were reversed. That's what made him distinctive. Again, it was an example of something we could do that other mainstream companies wouldn't even think of. You know, communally owned character. What the heck is that? We were experimenting.
And you also worked with Trina. You published feminist comics.
Yeah. Again, I mean, where I saw there were vacuums in the market, I tried to fill them in there. I didn't think there were enough women doing comics. Same with, you know, gay cartoonists. I was always looking for, you know, good African American cartoonists. Had a harder time there, but my feeling was the comics were the people's medium, and let's find people of all kinds to make them. It's as simple as that.
Any of you sensitive types, cover your eyes right now. The giant penis that invaded New York.
Yeah, that's one of my own. That actually, I was tripping on acid one time, and that vision came into my head, and I grabbed a notebook and I did a sketch, and the next day I said, oh, that's still funny, I think I'll do it. And that's probably the best-selling cover I ever did.
Did you come up with the idea of a comic book called Bizarre Sex? That sounds blatantly commercial, but
well, you know, again, part of it's hard to explain if you weren't there, but we were deliberately trying to be provocative. You have to remember, this was the counterculture. What was it counter to? It was counter to the prevailing, what we regarded as middle-class values, and the kind of people who thought the Vietnam War was a good idea. Well, you know, we thought it was a stupid idea. Go down the list. We thought pot should be legalized. Well, 40 years later, some places it is. All these issues, we were deliberately provocative. So Bizarre Sex was a way of saying, we don't have a comic code authority telling us what we can and cannot do. I wasn't interested in doing porn, but I wanted to have fun with the idea of, you know, I mean, dope comics was kind of in your face too. There's nothing subtle about that name. Ironically, a lot of the stuff in it was anti-drug, because what I was asking cartoonists to do is do stories about your own experiences, good or bad, and they weren't all good. But it would appear to be, actually, if you go back to that, there's an in joke here. I should have given you the version B of that. Leslie Cabarga drew that cover in the style of an animator, where, you know, there's a cell over it. The background is done in airbrush. You see the kind of softer color, but the line art was done on a clear overlay, and then he painted the reverse. Maybe I'm not explaining this well, but I had arranged to buy that original from him, and so when he sent it to me, he knew I was keeping it, and he had the clear cell then taped on all the edges with a note on it that said, "Do not remove the tape from the cell, and tell the printer blah blah blah, and remember not to lift the overlay, and blah blah blah, and well, okay, if you must lift the overlay, do it very carefully." So it's like, what the heck? So I removed the tape and I lifted it up, and under the fat bug sitting in the barber chair, there's a sign on the chair that says, "Denis Kitchen is a faggot." So
let's talk about that. You also did, Snarf was a anthology comic that you did, but you did a offshoot of that, surrealistic comics, which is hard to describe.
Well, yeah, Mondo Snarfle was a spin-off of Snarf, which was our humor anthology. I had always loved surrealist art, people like Salvador Dali, Rene Magritte. They were a big influence on me, and I knew some of the other cartoonists did too, so I said, let's just do a comic that's non-linear. We're not really telling a story, but it looks like a comic. It has the mechanics of a comic, but it's really kind of what I would just call a spontaneous visuals without being held back by plot. And so we did, and I said, this won't sell, but it's going to be fun. And it was fun, and it didn't sell very well, but I didn't care, because one of the nice things about being a publisher, if profit isn't your only motive, is you really can do whatever you want. And as long as I could pay the bills and draw a reasonable salary and pay the artists, I was willing to do crazy things, because I could. It's not the best business model again, but in those days we could get away with it, because I trusted our audience consisted of enough people who would give it a shot. Now, that's not to say we didn't maybe get some complaints from people saying, hey, I bought this thing called Mondo Snarfle and it didn't make any sense. I want my money back. You know, that didn't really happen. I just figured they understood, they got it. It's like you go to see a new wave film or an experimental film, you don't necessarily get it either, but you enjoy the experience, hopefully. It's thought-provoking. That's what we were doing.
And you decided to tap into another alternative market with gay comics?
Yeah, it had nothing to do with the note under the barber chair, by the way. But again, I just thought, the way this one came about was, some of you may know the work of Howard Cruz, who had been contributing to a number of my anthologies. And I'd never met Howard in person at that point. He lived in, I think, Mobile, Alabama. And he, in his Barefoots comics, he had a character named Headrack, who was a gay character.
That's the one with the goatee right there.
Yeah, and after I had read a couple of those stories, and it just seemed to me kind of autobiographical, you know. He's this artist, he's gay, and at one point in a letter to Howard, I said, you know, no offense intended, that you happen to be gay, and this is back in probably the early 80s. And he said, well, as a matter of fact, I am, and I was like, okay, fine. But then it got me thinking, he was literally afraid to come out of the closet for professional reasons, and in those days it was kind of dangerous, especially if you were a freelancer, and it could backfire. So I did say to him, you know, there ought to be a forum for gay cartoonists to talk about whatever they want to talk about, and I said, why don't you edit it? Would you be interested? And he liked the idea, but he was very nervous about it, partly because he was fearful. But when he finally decided, okay, I will, I'll come out and I'll do it, but he said, I don't really know any other gay cartoonists, you have to help me find them. Well, I don't know any either. So I said, I'll send a form letter to every artist in my Rolodex. So we did. That said, you know, if you happen to be gay, we're doing this new series. Now, some of the guys who do underground comics I think fairly, he said, were homophobic and proud of it. And so I got some pretty nasty letters saying, you know, why the heck did you send me this letter? You must be a faggot. But we uncovered, you know, a surprising number of artists who said, yeah, as a matter of fact, I am. And so before long, we had a series.
We discussed Omaha the Cat Dancer and the Comic Legal Defense Fund. And coming on, you had a great friendship with the late Will Eisner?
Yeah, that was one of the coolest things about being a publisher, was getting to know people like Will and publishing a lot of wonderful work. Will is someone who actually I met at a convention back in 1971, and the most amazing thing about that was he was actually looking for me because he had heard about underground comics, and what appealed to him was the way they were sold on a non-returnable basis, and the fact that artists received royalties, things that were appealing notions to him when he was working in the trenches of the comics industry. You know, it was a very different world. And publishers were those scoundrels I was talking about earlier. So Will and I had that conversation back in '71, and it led to our doing business, and we were pretty inseparable for, you know, next 35 years or so.
You published his work, and also the Spirit is most trademarked, right? You were a publisher of the New Adventures. You, sorry, that's the wrong one. That's the DC version. But, moving on, you also had there's the sexy picture of Dennis.
Where'd you find that?
Stacy who? A certain wife. You also had a very crucial relationship with Harvey Kurtzman.
Yeah, that was another great one. It was quite a privilege. Those two guys, to me, are two of the most important figures in comics history, and so it was terrific to be able to get to know them and to bring their work, both their pre-existing work and their new work, back to the market.
And and you also had him occasionally do work for you. This is a picture of your snarf.
Guest covers, we call them, yeah.
And there was another we had earlier discussed about the comics book up at the table.
That was meeting in Stan's office, so that would have been in '73, I think, when we conceived the idea of the comics with an X comics book.
Look in the second tier. Look at that's a picture of Stan Lee looking like
J. Jonah Jameson. Yeah. What's he saying there? Remind me.
What does he say? Enough said, Dan. You want to appeal to intellectuals.